US Special Forces versus the Wagner Group. Looking forward to this. The Battle of Kasham. Let's get into it.
500 pro-Syrian government troops led by a detachment of Wagner PMC fighters versus 40 American Special Forces and a handful of their Syrian rebel allies. But not only was no American even wounded, the opposing force was utterly devastated, and we have Russia to thank? The conflict in Syria has been raging for years, with the United States of America and the Russian Federation both supporting opposing sides. The US and its coalition partners support the Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of rebels from varying groups who all have one goal: overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad and bring him to justice for his many crimes against humanity. The Russian Federation naturally supports Assad's dictatorship, if for nothing else than because Assad has made it clear that the Russian Navy will maintain access to the Mediterranean via leased naval facilities on Syria's coast. The opportunity to commit wanton war crimes is just a plus for Russian troops. Both sides have been careful to steer clear of each other's military forces. When Syrian Democratic Forces captured Raqqa from ISIL in 2017, the Euphrates River became a de facto border between US-backed rebels and the Russian-backed Syrian government. A deconfliction line was set up between US and Russia to ensure that neither side accidentally engaged each other's forces, especially vital due to heavy presence of air power on the US side and ground-based air defenses on the Russian side.
Yeah, that's massive, having a deconfliction zone in place. Okay, so what that basically means is anything but past that line, you cannot send sort of air in, troops in. So it happens sort of, we do it in the British Army with we deconflict airspace. So when you fire in artillery, you make sure that when you've got the fast air or the Apaches, they don't cross a certain grid line. So they only come so far across, and then the artillery can fire, or you might deconflict on height, sort of elevation. Don't come below 20,000 feet. Depending on how high the rounds are firing, and it's the same with this. So they're basically saying don't have your aircraft come this far past this grid line, or northern or eastern, and we won't send anyone over northern eastern, and if there is, then you know it's enemy, and that's the best way of doing it. So they've deconflicted that, so there is no sort of confusion on where they're allowed to go.
While the Russian aerospace forces provide air support, Russia's main tool on the ground is the Wagner Group, the now infamous shadowy PMC, which acts like an extension of the Russian government, or at least it used to in the good old days before Prigozhin tried to march on Moscow before changing his mind. Back then at least, Wagner acted in unison with the Russian government's wishes, giving the Kremlin plausible deniability as its operatives inflicted mayhem across the Middle East and Africa. The Euphrates had served as a tentative border between pro-government and rebel forces, but the Syrian government had managed to secure a small salient across the river. The US and Russia both agreed that no more than 400 troops could be stationed in that salient at any one time, and while Syria nor Iranian-backed militias were party to this agreement, the Syrian government needed Russian support bad enough to agree to those terms by proxy. The troop limit was meant to prevent a sudden offensive by pro-government forces, which otherwise would have to cross the river, giving rebel forces ample time to mount a defense.
So yeah, very good. We saw this with Russia and Ukraine. Russia looked like they was on exercise, and they built up a massive amount of troops and vehicles, kit, personnel, and then they obviously mounted that offensive into Ukraine. And it's the same with this. If you can only have 400 troops, there's not too much you can do with 400 troops. Yeah, you could win some sort of battle. You may be able to take a bit of a ground, but you couldn't push too much of an offensive to sort of start a war and start taking over sort of major vital areas. You're just about getting an airport with that, maybe. So yeah, maximum 400 troops. Then that stops them having too many troops. So instead of US building thousands and thousands, and the Wagner Group only being able to get a couple of thousand, and the US being able to get hundreds of thousands, or tens of thousands, it just stops that from happening. There's any sort of less tension on those lines.
Details of what happened next remain murky, but a narrative can be pieced together from various sources. While disregarding the more outlandish claims out there, What we do know is the rebel forces held very profitable oil facilities near the Euphrates, and in past conflicts, Wagner PMC has often been compensated by being granted a share in liberated, a term we use extremely loosely here, mining and oil extracting or processing facilities. Several days before the infamous attack, U.S. intelligence intercepted communications between Wagner's chief Yevgeny Prigozhin and senior Syrian officials as well as Kremlin officials. The intercepted communications painted a picture of the Kremlin and the Syrian government giving Prigozhin the green light to go ahead with a, quote, fast and strong operation sometime in early February. The only problem for both the Syrian government and Prigozhin's ambitions was a detachment of U.S. special forces based near the lucrative oil facilities that Prigozhin hoped to seize. Wagner nor the Russian
Always
government could launch an all-out attack that couldn't be traced directly back to them, so days before the battle, U.S. intelligence began to note the arrival of dozens of fighters just across the Euphrates. U.S. officials quickly notified their Russian counterparts about this massing of troops, but the Russians claimed they had no control over local fighters. This would fly in the face of intercepted radio communications in Russian coming from the massing troops. Officially, the Russians claimed that the gathering force were Syrian government soldiers and members of various militias fighting on their own initiative. However, U.S. intelligence was extremely confident that a significant number of the fighters assembling in the area were Wagner military contractors.
And we see this a lot with Russia. What they do is they have a lot of local fighters or sort of private mercenaries, and then they're nothing to do with us when they are completely controlled with Russia. And that's exactly what's happening here.
As the force began to move out at around 3 p.m. local time, it was clear it was making its way to a Conoco gas plant near the city of Deir al-Zur. Right in the force's way was a headquarters manned by between 30 to 40 U.S. Delta Force soldiers and rangers, alongside a few Kurdish and Arab allies. If the Wagner-led force was going to capture the Conoco plant, it would have to go straight through the Americans. Watching via drone feeds, the tiny American-led force was not just outnumbered 10 to 1, but the Syrian force were advancing with 27 armored vehicles, including several tanks. U.S. forces on the ground had nothing that could stop a tank. About 20 miles away, Green Berets and a platoon of Marine infantry also watched the advancing force via drone feed, waiting for the call to roll out. They were equipped with Stryker armored vehicles, but could bring man-portable weapons to bear on the Syrian tanks. Even if the Marines and Green Berets got there in time, they would still be significantly outnumbered and outgunned in raw firepower. Also monitoring the situation was the American Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which immediately placed all available air assets on alert. Nobody could be sure the Wagner-led Syrian force was truly aiming for a fight. It wouldn't be the first time that they'd attempted to intimidate the US or its allies into concessions. However, the previously intercepted communications made the Americans wary that this was the big move Prigozhin had been asking for permission to make, and the formation's movement toward the Conoco plant seemed to back the suspicion up. As evening began to fall, it was clear that the Syrian formation was making its move. At the mission support site 20 miles away from the U.S. Delta Force and the Rangers, Marines scrambled into 4 Strykers to be ready to provide support if needed. They were still only 16 strong, but the Strykers could deliver a world of pain on their own with great precision. Their equipment was far superior to anything the Syrians or even Wagner forces had on hand, with extra Javelin anti-tank missiles tossed into the vehicles alongside thermal optics and extra food and water. Everyone involved expected a significant and protracted battle to come, but the order to move out hadn't been issued yet. At 8:30 p.m., the spearhead of the enemy formation had made it to a mile from the plant. Led by 3 T-72 tanks, the U.S. forces at the Conoco plant had nothing to match that level of firepower, but the tanks had stopped, and there was hope that the ensuing battle could be averted. Secretly, though, more tanks and vehicles gathered in nearby neighborhoods, using the buildings as cover to remain unseen. U.S. drones, though, watched their every move. Even so, the quick reaction force of Marines had not been dispatched, the Pentagon hoping that a conflict could be avoided. Then,
could you not dispatch the Marines and get them into a much better position? Okay, you don't want to make it look like you're attacking them. You don't want to sort of increase that tension and get them to do something that they maybe weren't wanting to do. But with them being 20 miles away, would you not move them a little bit closer, get them into some more fire support area where they're not seen, and then just sort of stand off just in case it does kick off? But we'll see what happens.
And suddenly, all hell broke loose. Long-range artillery began to open up on the American position, supplemented by much closer mortars. The T-72s also opened up with their main guns, while armored vehicles strafed with their cannons and heavy machine guns. The fire was largely inaccurate, but dangerous in volume. U.S. forces and their partners ran for cover behind dirt berms, preparing to use their small store of anti-tank missiles on the advancing vehicles. However, the U.S. still attempted to avoid an all-out confrontation, very confident Russian Wagner mercenaries were amongst enemy troops. The last thing the Trump administration wanted was an accidental war with Russia. For 15 minutes after the attack began, U.S. officials repeatedly called their Russian counterparts, asking them to recall the attacking force. However, Russian officials repeatedly denied knowledge of the attack, claiming that the gathered forces were Syrian volunteers and government troops that they had no control over. The quick reaction force was already on its way though, but driving on very rough roads and with their headlights off to avoid being targeted. Instead, they relied on night vision and thermal cameras, making an already slow drive even slower. With U.S. troops under fire and the Russians refusing to cease the attack, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis turned to General Joseph F. Dunford Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Deep inside the belly of the Pentagon, they watched via live drone feeds the advancing forces who were now starting to become dangerously accurate with their fire as they drew closer. Secretary of Defense Mattis then gave a simple command: annihilate them. Within seconds, the Secretary of Defense's order had reached American commanders in the region. At the Conoco plant, the Rangers and Green Berets had already expended their small supply of anti-tank.
Guys, it's time to stop powdering your balls. That's why Manscaped developed crop
weapons. This had knocked several of the armored vehicles out of the fight, but just under 24 more continued to advance, albeit a hell of a lot more cautiously now. The
really good anti-tank missiles, something you definitely want to have in your armory when going out in sort of a large patrol or as part of your fire support if possible. Very accurate and very good at taking out armor.
Russians had gotten their first taste of the Javelin before being served a 3-course meal in Ukraine years later. But U.S. forces were entirely outmanned, and enemy artillery was making it difficult to engage approaching troops. Within minutes of General Mattis's order, the U.S. Air Force began to bring the pain. First to strike were armed drones, the same ones currently overwatching the conflict, but these drones had very limited munitions and could do little to impact the fighting on the ground. Additional Reaper drones began to arrive, carrying out precision strikes against enemy artillery and mortar positions. Next came the waves of American fighters. F-22 Raptors had already been sent near the fighting. Russian air defenses extended well over this part of Syria, and the U.S. could not know how Russia would react once it began to launch a full-scale air operation. The Raptors therefore had been sent to ensure Russian fighters did not interfere, but with none on the horizon, they were turned loose on the ground forces below. F-15 Strike Eagles were hot on their heels, delivering punishing precision strikes against artillery and mortar positions.
A lot of precision strike missiles going into this target here. Pretty cool to see, and they're very accurate and very good. Can land within meters, if not even closer now with some of the guided missiles that we've got.
At around 11:30 p.m., the quick reaction force of Marines had reached the fighting, but forced to hang back due to the heavy artillery. Their own vehicles would be made mincemeat by the enemy tanks and the heavier infantry fighting vehicles, so the Marines were forced to sit back and wait, but they wouldn't have to wait long. Marine rocket artillery based dozens of miles away had been feeding precision rockets into the fight with the aid of drones, striking at enemy artillery. Not long after, a flight of Apache helicopters came screaming out of the horizon, delivering a withering barrage of missiles and rockets to the advancing tanks and armored vehicles.
Another thing you definitely want is Apache attack helicopters. Amazing bits of kit, amazing bit of fire support.
A Russian survivor would later describe the American Apaches as whirling carousels of heavy machine gun and cannon fire as the armored helicopters strafed across the advancing enemy at treetop height, wary of man-portable air defense weapons. High above them, though, the Air Force had finally brought out the big guns, the B-52 strategic bombers. These lumbering arsenal ships had taken longer to get to the fight than the much nimbler strike aircraft, but they disgorged earth-shattering amounts of firepower on the enemy below. The enemy artillery and mortar positions were of highest priority as they were preventing the QRF from reaching the beleaguered Rangers and Delta Force operatives. With the artillery destroyed, the QRF finally made it to the besieged American defenders, providing some much-needed relief, even if they were still woefully outnumbered. U.S. planes low on fuel or out of ordnance had by now been forced to turn back, opening up a brief window for the Wagner-led attack. Many of the enemy had abandoned their vehicles by now more a liability than a protection, and advanced on foot. The newly arrived Marines fed fresh ammo to the defenders, who by now were nearly out of everything, down to just a few magazines of rifle ammunition. Machine guns and javelins opened up once more, unleashing hell on the advancing troops. From inside their striker vehicles, Marines operated the remote weapon stations, their thermal sensors making it impossible for the enemy to hide in the dark. An AC-130 gunship arrived in the sky overhead, opening up with its howitzer and cannons. Air Force combat controllers began to direct the next wave of American strike aircraft, which had been quickly refueled and rearmed, their weary pilots refusing to be replaced as long as U.S. troops were still under fire. Everything American that could fly in the region was put into the air, the defenders still being massively outnumbered and overmatched in firepower. Every single flight of strike aircraft and attack helicopter was like a flight of guardian angels, delivering righteous fury in the form of precision high explosives and armor-piercing cannon fire.
They are not holding back on this, especially with the air.
An hour later, the ill-fated attack finally halted. Enemy troops began a hasty withdrawal. In a show of good faith, the U.S. Air Force ceased atomizing the retreating troops. Some were allowed to return to collect their dead. The 500-strong force had been shattered, and the only casualty on the U.S. side was an allied Syrian fighter who had been lightly wounded. So, what really happened, and who was in charge, and how was Russia responsible for this overwhelming U.S. victory? Even years after the incident, there remained significant gaps in the public knowledge over the event. Russia denied all responsibility, claimed that no Wagner forces had been involved in or had knowledge of the attack. This was in direct opposition to released U.S. surveillance footage which showed an airstrike on a Wagner artillery position directly supporting the attack. In the months to come, independent journalists inside Russia confirmed that an unusually high number of dead Wagner troops arrived in Russia after the battle. These journalists also confirmed a large number of Wagner mercenaries flown to Russian hospitals in the days after the battle. However, officially the Russian government stated that only 4 Russian volunteers had died in the attack, though later the Syrian and Russian government would say that it's possible dozens were killed or injured.
It's always a bit like this back and forward, isn't it? You know, they're never going to properly admit, they're always going to deny, because it's all these top secret classified missions. Obviously, Russia can't be seen to go into war with the US, so that's why I have these privately contracted mercenaries. And there's always loads of evidence, but Russia will always deny. So you're never going to win that one. But you do see these sort of journalists and all these other bits of information coming out. Very impressive considering the amount of armour and vehicles that did come up the US that they didn't even really get a casualty apart from the local Syrians. So, you know, you'd think some sort of minor casualty, but looks like nothing.
Publication Der Spiegel would conduct an investigation and allege that no Russians were involved in the fighting. Other sources inside Russia made incredible claims of 200 Wagnerites being killed. A Russian investigative group, Conflict Intelligence Team, would do its own investigation and estimate that as many as 30 Russians died in the fighting. In 2023, The Gray Zone, a Telegram channel often associated with Wagner, published a summary of the infamous battle. From interviews with Wagner soldiers present, U.S. forces first used Reaper drones to take out the lead and rear vehicles of the formation in a classic ambush. Then Apache helicopters came roaring into the confused mess, decimating anyone attempting to retreat. A loitering AC-130 gunship pounded defensive positions into dust, even as men attempted to find cover in nearby buildings. F-16s hounded them from above, with one Wagnerite allegedly claiming that in the morning the area was littered with liquefied gun barrels and solidified sand, melted in the intense heat of the American attack and re-solidifying after. The Gray Zone would publish accounts from Wagnerites who rallied against the Russian Air Force, which had jets stationed nearby but did not move to aid them. Allegedly, some pilots asked for permission to respond but were refused. With loitering F-22s and F-15s, it was definitely the right call. The Gray Zone would also claim that Wagner casualties were very high, but far less than the 600 or 200 that other outlets were reporting. We'll probably never know how many Wagnerites or even Russian special forces were directly involved in the fighting, but it's clear that the attack was led by Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin, who wanted to seize the Conoco oil field at all costs. However, in a surprising twist, and perhaps one that cemented in Prigozhin's mind the fact that he could no longer trust Putin's government, it was the Russian military itself which ensured the attack would ultimately fail. Russian air defenses were dense in the region and posed a significant challenge for U.S. aircraft. In the years since, the world would learn that despite Russia refusing to recall the attack, they had ordered their air defenses to stand down, giving the green light to the U.S. to use its air power freely. Why this remains unknown. Perhaps Russia wished to continue its guise of plausible deniability. Wagner is a Russian PMC that works directly in the interest of the Russian government, but as a PMC, it affords Russia the option to disown or disenfranchise itself from any of the group's actions. Turning off the air defenses might have been Russia playing to this plausible deniability. After all, keeping the air defenses on would have essentially married the Russian government to the attack on the Conoco oil field. That would have come with significant consequences, inevitably sparking a significant buildup of U.S. forces in the region and dramatically escalating the possibility of all-out conflict between the two sides. It's also possible that Russia simply significantly underestimated U.S. air power. Air operations are difficult, a carefully choreographed dance of logistics, platforms, and personnel. As the Ukraine war has proven, Russia itself is incapable of coordinating significant air operations, let alone a massive and rapid, extremely time-sensitive response. The Russians might have assumed the U.S. shared this weakness, or that it simply couldn't coordinate so many different platforms so quickly. The Russians bet wrong. The U.S. air operation in the Battle of Kasham is nothing short of a...
Hello, and welcome to the top 5 bestmatches.com. Today, we'll be testing
military miracle. No matter which way you stack it, even with significant air support, U.S. forces should have been easily overrun. But the U.S. absolutely annihilates its own budget to find extremely terrifying capabilities you literally never want to be on the wrong end of. Firstly, the U.S. air fleet has the largest capability for close air support of any air fleet in the world. While Russian aerospace forces struggle to deliver accurate ground support, there's hardly any U.S. air combat platform that is incapable of doing the job that Russian planes simply aren't equipped for, and their pilots aren't trained for.
Definitely.
The ability for U.S. warplanes from an F-15 to a B-52 to deliver precision ground fire is unmatched by any other nation in the world, and it's basically illegal for any U.S. aircraft of any kind to take to the skies without the ability to drop a bomb with high precision right where the troops need it the most. But U.S. logistics and command and control is the secret hero of the show here, because Russia likely did not expect such a massive and well-coordinated response of so many different air platforms. The U.S. threw literally everything, including the kitchen sink, into the sky that day, knowing that its ground forces were hopelessly outmatched. But such massive air operations require significant command and control expertise and resources, especially to deconflict targets, ensuring that one attack wave isn't simply hitting the exact same already destroyed targets that the last wave did.
Yeah, they would have had some really good command and control at the top, but it sounds like they've had some really good forward air controllers on the ground, deconflicted and coordinating that onto the targets, or forward air controllers within sort of the offices if you're using sort of a lot of it through drones. So yeah, really good forward air controllers there.
This is a significant problem for Russian aerospace forces in Ukraine. Russia's problems don't just end there, because the nation is incapable of deconflicting its airspace as well. Hilariously, Russian air defenses in Ukraine are in an intense race with Ukrainian air defenses for the highest number of downed Russian aircraft. That's because Russia lacks the expertise and systems to effectively manage large air operations alongside ground air defenses. It's unlikely then that Russia could have foreseen the expert ballet of command and control that saw U.S. air power hammer attacking forces nearly non-stop for 5 hours. The Battle of Kasham was, well, embarrassing for the Syrian government and for Wagner. But it was also a warning to the rest of the world. If you pick a fight with the US, you absolutely, positively, definitely cannot allow US air power to enter the picture.
Very good video, very interesting. I know sometimes people don't like the infographics. I do really like the graphics that they do. There's a lot of time and effort that obviously goes into this, a lot of research. It's quite interesting that US Special Forces didn't get any casualties at all, even with the amount of arm and manpower that was sent at them. And it also shows the capability of the US, the power they have, and they actually are pretty well coordinated to send in all those assets. But that is what the US do. We've worked with them before. UK, little collateral damage as possible. Destroy as minimal as possible. US, don't care, destroy it all, let's go in, smash it up, just get the job done. That's all they sort of care about, and that's basically what they did here. Really enjoyed the video. Let me know what you want to see next. Remember to click the subscription button. I'll see you soon.